Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Fenton from Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire, Illinois. Welcome back. And today what we're going to do, obviously, we're going to go over that practice FRQ that you received from Dr. Swope. And today we're going to cover motivation. So motivation is basically the whys of behavior and mental processes. These are factors that direct and sustain goal-oriented actions. And we're going to even look a little bit at research. Okay, so our warm-up, as always, is yesterday's FRQ. And yesterday you had an FRQ about Mrs. Schmidlap, and you had some terms from the developmental psychology unit. You had conventional moral reasoning, so Kohlberg, formal reasoning, so that's cognitive, and that's Piaget, identity versus role confusion, Erikson, and personal fable, which is David Elkind, but that's not a name you need to worry about. I also wanted to point out here in the directions, it says that you need to make, you should present a cogent argument. And that's a frequent term that you might see in the directions on an FRQ. And cogent, again, means convincing. Like you need to be clearly articulating your point. So first up, we have conventional moral reasoning. So moral reasoning, so this is Kohlberg's 3-level theory about how people progress in their ability to determine right or wrong. And when you have an example, like when Kohlberg did his Heinz dilemma, it didn't necessarily matter how they answered, like, you know, whether they stole the drug or didn't steal the drug, but it's the why behind the reasoning. So at the conventional level, people are deciding if behaviors are moral, that is right or wrong, based on, you know, following the law, or what results in acceptance from others. So it could be parents, teachers, peers. So in the case of this example, you have to apply it to what makes potentially teaching teenagers difficult, is that some students may think it's okay to cheat because when they cheat, they gain acceptance from their peers. So gaining acceptance makes it therefore morally right. And remember with Kohlberg, you have those 3 levels. You have pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Now with formal reasoning, this is part of Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. It's a stage theory, a discontinuity theory for how thought develops, right? Cognition. And it starts with sensory motor. Then you have pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And in formal reasoning, formal operational stage, you would have the ability to reason formally. And what that means is you can think about and analyze and work with abstract ideas, meaning ideas that kind of have to be imagined. They can't be described with like real kind of specific, what we call concrete examples. So you have to have abstract ideas in both the definition and your application. And abstract concepts might be things like freedom. Okay, identity versus role confusion. So remember Erik Erikson's developmental theory is a psychosocial personality development theory. So he's a neo-Freudian, and so his early stages, they kind of line up with Freud's early stages. And he veers from Freud, and it's less of an emphasis on like sexual and aggressive urges, but more social interaction. So it's a psychosocial theory. And identity versus role confusion is stage 5, Erikson's 5th stage of personality development. And what he means by identity, what you need for a synonym there is like a sense of self, or like who you are as a person. So again, it might be difficult to teach teenagers because they might rebel or, you know, defy class rules because they're experimenting with who they are as a person or developing their sense of self. And this could be obviously consciously or unconsciously experimenting and kind of determining who you are as a person. And this coincides with adolescence. Okay, personal fable is an idea that adolescents believe they are, you know, an important character in a narrative about their life and that they are completely unique and invincible. And the thing with personal fable is this is one way of potentially explaining why adolescent egocentrism can lead to risky decision-making. So in this case, it is challenging to teach adolescents because they may feel invincible and they may think they could never get caught for cheating. Okay, so hopefully you were able to answer all those questions and check your answers. Feel free to pause, rewind, double check your work. double check if you spaced out your answer, answered in order. Did you define or at least include all the aspects of the definition in your application? And did you apply? Did you double check? So if you go back to that identity versus role confusion, if in your application and definition, you just keep repeating the word identity and you don't essentially explain it, say sense of self or who you are as a person, if you just keep saying identity, then you would probably not score because you're just kind of repeating the prompt. And hopefully you are practicing timing yourself. All right, so today we're going to talk about motivation and emotion. Well, actually motivation today, emotion tomorrow, and then on the following day we'll do personality with Dr. Swope. So this unit 7, has kind of 3 large chunks, and today we're going to focus on motivation. And if you remember when we talked about the approaches to psychology, you have the biopsychosocial approach, and that's kind of how we're going to approach motivation. So we're going to start with biologically based motivational concepts. And here are several of them. And these also involve other pieces too. There's cognition involved and certainly sociocultural influences as well. But we're going to focus on the biological aspects of these motivation concepts first. Okay, starting with motivation again. Motivation is this set of factors that activate, direct, and sustain behavior like in pursuit of a goal. And from a biological perspective, we're going to start with needs. So these are biological requirements that you need for survival. So you need food, water, oxygen, sleep. Drives, on the other hand, are psychological tension states, either primary or secondary, that are created when there's a deficiency in a need. So if you have an unmet need for oxygen or for water, then that would create the psychological tension, which might be like thirst. And primary drives are innate motivations for behaviors that are required for survival. So hunger, thirst, escape from like a painful stimulus, like a loud noise or a shock. And then there's secondary drives, which are learned motivations that you don't need for survival, but they're learned. And that might be things like success or achievement, money, appearance. And next up, you're going to see this word a lot when you're talking about the biological basis of motivation. It's homeostasis. This is the body's design to maintain this balanced internal state. So body temperature, the amount of nutrients you need, sleep has to be within this kind of certain set range or balance. So for example, your homeostatic kind of balance for internal body temperature would be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or about 37 degrees Celsius. And if your body is internally too cold, then your hypothalamus, which regulates these drives, is going to set in motion maybe something that signals a response to shiver, right? And maybe even motivate voluntary behavior. If you're too hot, on the other hand, the hypothalamus is also going to try to get you back to homeostasis, and maybe it'll send out signals that's going to lead you to sweat and motivate different voluntary behaviors. And next up, we're going to talk about this concept of arousal a little bit during this section. And when we're talking about arousal, we're talking about, central autonomic nervous system stimulation, right? So your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activation. Okay, so let's talk about the Yerkes-Dodson Law. And I've put a little exam tip here to remind you that this is not the same as optimal arousal motivation theory. So I'm going to separate it by a section so you think of these differently. Yerkes-Dodson, as you can see in this graph, is the relationship between performance. So on that y-axis, you have performance level from low to high. And on the x-axis, you have that arousal. So again, that's physiological alertness. So there's a relationship between the level of arousal and performance, and it graphs as an inverted U, is the term that you'll hear. Please, please, please make sure you note that an inverted U is not a bell curve. A bell curve is a very specific measurement of, statistical distribution. So it's an inverted U, and so most tasks are going to be best at a moderate level. That's the top of that U. If it is a really easy task, then what you want, if you see on the orange side of this curve, a slightly higher level of arousal, slightly to the right on that x-axis. And the peak for a difficult task would be slightly lower, right? And sometimes this Yerkes-Dodson law is used in sports psychology. So if you're playing an easy opponent, you might want to, psych yourself up, right? Like slightly increase your level of physiological arousal so that you don't take the win for granted and then lose unexpectedly when maybe you were heavily favored to win. If, however, on the other hand, you're playing a very difficult opponent or you're doing some sort of difficult task, if you're too amped up, too excited physiologically, you might fall behind really early, you might do poorly. So basically with Yerkes-Dodson and arousal, we have this desire to escape from boredom, increase arousal, and escape from stress, decrease arousal. The first motivation theory, broad theory I want to talk about is evolutionary theory. And evolutionary theory was originally kind of explored as something called instinct theory. That's an older version. And remember that an instinct is an unchanging sequence of behaviors that like all members of a particular species would use in response to a stimulus and involves no learning. So instincts would be, aggressive reactions. It could be imprinting in birds and attachment, if you remember Konrad Lorenz. Newborn baby reflexes like rooting and Babinski. These are behaviors that are not instincts, are behaviors not affected by practice. They're innate survival behaviors. So initially with motivation theory in the early 20th century, there was a lot of emphasis on this idea of instinct theory. And theorists would publish these like elaborate lists of human instincts. And the problem with instinct theory is that it was circular reasoning. So they would say, well, we have a love instinct, right? And the reason we know we have a love instinct is because we love. So that circular reasoning of trying to identify a bunch of instincts has kind of been replaced. It has been replaced with a modern evolutionary theory. And this says that behaviors that we see, motivations that we have adaptive or survival value. So they were naturally selected because, early humans who behaved this way, who were motivated in this manner, had a survival or reproductive advantage. So the next biological theory I want to talk about is drive reduction theory. And drive reduction theory is pretty complex. So if you were to write about this on an FRQ, you would have to have all three pieces. So we're going to break it down. Again, the aim is homeostasis. So drive reduction, you want to reduce the drive, reduce that tension, and return to homeostasis. So assuming you're starting at a homeostasis place, right? Eventually, if there's a deficiency in a biological need, so in this image, there might be a deficiency in a biological need for, say, food. You don't have enough nutrients or enough water. And what happens is when you have that deficiency in a biological need, it creates a psychological tension, that internal psychological tension, which is actually what the drive is, right? So remember, we want to reduce that drive, reduce the tension, and return to homeostasis. So drive reduction theory says that a deficiency in a biological need is going to create an internal psychological tension, and that tension is going to motivate an individual to act in such a way that they can fulfill that biological need and return to homeostasis. So, for example, if you have a deficiency in a biological need, you do not have enough sleep, that's going to create a powerful tension, a powerful drive that's going to motivate you to act in some way to fulfill that need and get your body back to homeostasis. And sleep is a very powerful drive. Now, the strengths of drive reduction theory is that it explains biologically based homeostasis-driven behaviors really well. The weakness of drive reduction theory is it does not explain many other behaviors, many other motivated behaviors, such as something like curiosity, thrill seeking. There is no deficiency in a biological need that would cause somebody to want to go skydiving, right? If you are talking about someone who runs a marathon, that's not going to get you back to homeostasis, right? That's going to lead to a deficiency in a biological need. So what's motivating that? So we have other theories beyond drive reduction. Then we have optimal arousal. And again, remember, this is not the same as Yerkes-Dodson. Yerkes-Dodson is the relationship between arousal and performance. This is explaining motivation as being a result of the fact that every person has a personally preferred level of physiological stimulation, right? So that activation of that autonomic nervous system. And we're going to be motivated to either escape from boredom or escape from stress and try to maintain that personally preferred level. So again, arousal is that bodily mobilization to cope with situational demands. And it would be autonomic stuff like, heart rate, breathing. And people essentially, according to this theory, are motivated to act strategically to either increase or decrease that level of arousal. So if you're bored, you'd be motivated to do something to increase your arousal level. You might, if you were bored in class, you might doodle, you might text a friend or check your phone or tap your pencil. If you are extremely stressed, right, your autonomic arousal is too high, you might be motivated to seek or to do actions to lower that. Another kind of biologically based motivation is affiliation motivation. And if you see here, I put it next to Maslow's pyramid. So Maslow certainly talks about affiliation motivation, or he just refers to it as belongingness or love needs. And affiliation is basically the drive that we have to form attachments and make connections with other people. So from an evolutionary perspective, if you're looking back to that evolutionary theory, social motivation, affiliation motivation exists because early humans who were motivated to form connections and make friendships and bonds were more likely to survive. And we've noticed a lot of interesting changes. Psychologists are studying right now changes in affiliation with relation to social media, like how we relate to each other, how we connect. Certainly how we connect in these times is very different than how we were connecting months ago. How do you measure affiliation motivation? You typically use either a self-report measure. So there's a variety of objective personality tests that would measure this type of motivation. And it's also sometimes measured with projective tests as well. So like the thematic apperception test, the TAT, where you are looking at ambiguous illustrations, and based on people's responses, psychologists could potentially measure your level of need for affiliation. Okay, psychological and sociocultural based motivation concepts. And again, there's going to be overlap with the biological piece here as well. So first up, we have incentive theory. Remember, we talked about how drive reduction theory doesn't explain curiosity behavior, right? So in this example, we have monkeys who are curious, and that's certainly not about reducing a drive and fulfilling a biological need. And another thing to note is that if there's both a biological need, right? So if you have a deficiency in a physiological need, you're hungry, creating that hunger drive. And there's an incentive, maybe the smell of freshly, baking bread, you're going to be potentially powerfully motivated to take actions and eat. In motivation theory, we also talk about the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So extrinsically, a desire to perform because you are seeking a reward or trying to avoid punishment. And intrinsic, you're doing it just for its own sake, or to be effective. So if you are learning French because you want to get a job, or you're afraid that you might lose your job if you can't demonstrate French proficiency, that's extrinsic. If you're learning French because you have a genuine interest in the language and you just want to explore that, that's an intrinsic motivation. And how these can relate is this very unusual kind of counterintuitive finding called the overjustification effect. And what happens is if you have someone who is intrinsically motivated to do something, they're doing it for pure love and enjoyment, right? And then you start paying them for it, like a professional athlete. Sometimes what can happen is that weakens that initial intrinsic motivation, and the individual is less likely to engage in that behavior if they're not being paid, for example, if you take away that reward. So sometimes offering a reward for an activity that is previously being engaged in without reward, right? This shift to an extrinsic from an intrinsic motivation undermines, in many cases, the individual's existing intrinsic motivation. Another psychological factor related to motivation is this concept of self-efficacy. And this is part of Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory. And basically, motivation is impacted by the differences that we have about our levels of belief in our ability to master a particular task. So, for example, if you might have high self-efficacy in something like math, right? And maybe you have low self-efficacy for dance. So having high self-efficacy, you're more willing, to dig in and try. So if you have a strong belief in your ability to master math, when you encounter a difficult problem, you're going to persist, right? You're going to keep going. But if you believe that you have low self-efficacy, this can unfortunately lead to learned helplessness. Like you could actually, be more likely to give up, right? And not persist in the face of adversity. Okay, so just kind of want to compare these two terms because you have self-efficacy, which is Albert Bandura, and your belief in your ability to master a task, which can be high or low. And you could have different levels of self-efficacy depending on the task. Whereas locus of control is a little bit different. With locus of control, this is the beliefs a person has about the causes of what happens to them, right? If you have an internal locus of control, then individuals believe that they can influence what happens to them, like by working hard, for example. And external, on the other hand, might believe that their actions have little impact and that what happens to them is maybe the results of luck, or fate. Now, if you have an individual with high self-efficacy and an internal locus of control, there's a strong relationship between those two factors, and that's going to be someone who's going to be able to persist and have maybe higher levels of achievement motivation. A little note about Albert Bandura here. Albert Bandura is a social cognitive theorist. I don't know why it just says social. And he studied observational and social learning, if you remember the Bobo study from the learning unit. He's also known for this concept of self-efficacy and how it affects motivation. And he has a personality theory called reciprocal determinism. So Albert Bandura appears in numerous chapters. He's a very important theorist. And whereas the name per se isn't what you should focus on, but any theorist that is kind of this prolific across chapters, you want to make sure you understand their theories well. So I would make sure that you were really clear on observational learning, self-efficacy, and reciprocal determinism. Other names like Bandura that kind of appear maybe 4 more times in the curriculum would be Abraham Maslow, the humanist, B.F. Skinner, and behaviorism, and William James. If you remember all the way back to functionalism. We're even going to talk about William James again tomorrow with his emotion theory. Okay, next up is cognitive dissonance theory, which is related to motivation. Now, this is a term that would also be present in the social psychology unit, which is not on the exam. However, cognitive dissonance theory is also part of motivation. So this is a concept that would be potentially on your exam. And what cognitive dissonance is, okay, the term itself is this uncomfortable state that results because a person is holding 2 conflicting beliefs, or your belief and your behavior conflict, and that makes you uncomfortable. And it's that discomfort, right? That tension that if it's strong enough, right? If it's great enough, it's going to motivate you to change your behavior. So if you have, for example, like you believe that you need to recycle and that littering is wrong, right? You care about the environment. And your inconsistent behavior might be that you threw a banana peel out your car window, right? And then you have this tension, you feel bad. So the only way to reduce that tension potentially is to either kind of alter your belief, maybe say, well, the banana peel is biodegradable, or come up with some sort of excuse, right? But if the tension is strong enough, it might actually motivate you to change your behavior, right? Change your behavior in terms of, I don't know, turn that car around and go pick up that banana peel. If you believe in the environment and conserving, and then you don't use public transportation when you could, if that tension, that discomfort between the discrepancy in your belief and your behavior is great enough, it would potentially motivate you to change your behavior. Okay, I want to talk about achievement motivation. So the other social motivation we mentioned earlier was affiliation, that need to belong, which definitely has a biological kind of component. Achievement is a little bit more on the psychological side, and it's certainly influenced by sociocultural factors as well. For Maslow, this would be the higher needs on the pyramid. So from esteem on up, right? Whereas the physiological needs and the safety needs, and then you have affiliation with the belongingness needs. Achievement motivation is the more top of the pyramid. And it's certainly learned, from observation and learned from cultures in terms of like your level of achievement motivation. It's definitely correlated to self-efficacy. People with high levels of self-efficacy are more likely, again, to take on challenging tasks and persist in the face of challenges. Individuals with a low need for individuals with a high level of achievement, interestingly, they tend to pursue moderately difficult tasks, right? They're going to want to be successful. So they're going to prefer to set their own goals. They're going to be competitive and persistent, but again, they're going to pick moderately difficult tasks. Whereas individuals with a lower level of achievement are going to tend to avoid or perform less well on very challenging tasks because they don't want to fail. In the same sense. How do you measure this? Again, you are going to measure this using either self-report measures, objective tests, or potentially, again, that thematic apperception test, where the participants would have to create a story about an ambiguous image, which is also a personality test. Okay, so let's take a look at Maslow. I mentioned that he comes up frequently, of course, across the program, and his theory is extremely influential. So the aim of this motivation theory is that you want to fulfill successively higher levels of rank ordered needs. So for Maslow, you needed to fulfill those physiological needs first before you would be interested in pursuing those higher level needs. And there are certainly exceptions to this idea that the lower needs must be met first, right? And then Maslow has, at the top, you have self-actualization, kind of living up to your unique potential. But he also talks about this even higher level, this idea of self-transcendence, that people are striving for a sense of meaning or purpose that's beyond themselves. And I thought I would point out this book by Viktor Frankl. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. It's a quote from this book. And the book has kind of two parts. The first half of Man's Search for Meaning is Viktor Frankl's experience is living in a concentration camp. And the second half is his therapy method that's kind of very similar to this humanistic idea of self-transcendence. So these two were contemporaries, both Maslow and Frankl. Also, you can kind of see the connection here between humanism and kind of the neo-Freudian theories, this idea of, Alfred Adler talked about striving for superiority, trying to be the best version of yourself, is very similar to this Maslow idea of self-actualization and self-transcendence. Okay, just going to share a little quick test tip here. Sometimes you see terms when you look at, if you're looking at a glossary, you're going to see a whole bunch of psychology terms that start with self-dash. And just make sure if you see a term like this on your AP exam, on your FRQ, that you read carefully. It's very easy potentially to read self-efficacy and then write about self-esteem because you're misreading it. So just, be careful, just kind of giving you a heads up. There's a lot of terms that can look similar. And if you look at something like a self-concept, that's your set of unique characteristics and beliefs about yourself. That's kind of like that identity piece in that Erikson stage. And then esteem is more of a value judgment about how worthy you are compared to yourself, like maybe in the past or to others. Okay, so this is a little extra practice FRQ that you can do on your own. Create an application for the following motivational theories and concepts. So this is a great way to practice. Even if you're looking at multiple choice questions, you'll see maybe an example and maybe the answer to that scenario that was presented is Maslow's hierarchy or it's optimal arousal. But you see all the other distractors. How could you create an example that matched each of the other distractors? So you can use a multiple choice question to also study and prepare for an FRQ. So again, also, I want you to consider which theory best describes specific types of motivated behaviors. So which of these theories would be the best way to describe why someone would be motivated to go to college or run a marathon? All right, a little quick check for understanding. I'm going to give you a couple short examples. And you identify the motivation theory present. And finally, number 3, which one of these fits best? And again, I'm not sure that you might want to actually take a look at these and take a look at them in relation to the definition. Even if you can identify that it's the right term, are all the pieces of that definition there? So for number 1, we have optimal arousal. Remember, people are motivated to act strategically to either increase or decrease their level of physiological arousal to reach that kind of personally preferred level. Number 2 is drive reduction. You're trying to get to that balanced state. And on your FRQ, instead of saying balanced state, you'd probably want to use the psychological term. You'd want to say homeostasis. So hopefully you recognize that as homeostasis and you recognize the pieces of the drive reduction theory. And the last one is an example of the Yerkes-Dodson Law. So you can kind of see how this is different, how arousal is related to performance as opposed to optimal arousal theory that's presented in number 1. Okay, here's number 4. And number 5. Hopefully you can pick these out. So for number 4, this is an example of how cognitive dissonance, that state of discomfort or tension when your behavior and your beliefs don't match, right? That's the discomfort. When you're motivated to change your behavior, you're kind of relieving or eliminating cognitive dissonance. And we have a man who likes to draw cats, and he does it, for fun, just for the love of it. Then he starts being paid, and then pretty soon he doesn't draw unless he's being paid. That would be an example of the overjustification effect. And since we're talking about cats, here's some cats. These cats are named Salem and Nala, and they were rescue kittens and perfectly happy now. Hunger motivation. So with hunger is a great example of the biopsychosocial approach. You have these biological, psychological, and cultural aspects that influence, when we're hungry, when we're full, and when we eat and how much we eat. And you might want to take a look at the Cannon and Washburn study. So one thing that we found out is that signals from the stomach, like stomach contractions, are one aspect of what causes hunger feelings. So Washburn, who was Walter Cannon's graduate student, swallowed a balloon and it was inflated when he was in his stomach, right? And then he was asked to press the key every time he felt hungry, and they were able to track that. So sure enough, hunger is associated with stomach contractions. But later research shows there's more than just stomach contractions, because rats, for example, who had their stomachs removed, still were hungry, still ate. We also have this idea of hormones, right? So you have glucose, which is a nutrient, and the hormones, insulin and glucagon, which are released by the pancreas that kind of monitor blood glucose levels and try to keep them in that homeostasis state, that balance. So if you have low levels of glucose, you're going to have hunger pains. You're going to be hungry. Your brain's going to motivate you to eat. We also have 2 other hunger hormones. We have ghrelin, which is released by the stomach, which is a signal to eat, and orexin, released from the brain, from the hypothalamus, also is a signal to eat. And then we have 2 different satiety hormones in PYY and leptin. Taking a look at the brain and hunger circuits, we certainly have the limbic system, which includes the hypothalamus, and that's going to be the place where you have cravings for specific foods. The hypothalamus is in the middle, the second image here, this one. It's just little tiny orange section is in the limbic system, and it's responsible for hunger, thirst, and other drives by monitoring and controlling body chemistry. Like, it makes you feel hungry when you eat, motivates you to eat. It also regulates the endocrine system, so it's related to many of those other hunger hormones. If you remember the hypothalamus, there's like the 5 Fs, right? So there's the feeding drive, there's fighting and fleeing, there's Fahrenheit, it's going to maintain that homeostatic internal body temperature. There's the flirting drive, and certainly thirst. The prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobes is also involved in hunger. Taste cues, right? Like when you taste something that's sweet or salty, it kind of indicates a reward, right, for eating certain foods. Within the hypothalamus, there's some areas, and there's some studies with rats, basically. So the lateral hypothalamus, which are like the sides, right? These are a hunger sensors. So if these are stimulated in the animal, the appetite will increase. If they're destroyed, appetite's eliminated. And then if you have the ventromedial, that's the fullness sensor, right? So if it's stimulated, appetite's going to decrease, they're going to be full. If it's destroyed, appetite's going to increase. Again, broadly looking at hunger, there's also other psychological factors like your moods impact what you eat, what you're thinking about food, conditioning, certainly the mere exposure effect, repeated presentation of certain foods, external incentives, how food looks. Sociocultural norms would include things for like what time you eat, what you eat, how fast you eat, the variety of foods. It's hunger motivation. Okay, so doing the debriefing a little bit differently. So consider the process of motivation through the lens of the psychological approaches. So again, motivation is the whys of behaviors, like factors that direct and sustain goal-oriented actions. But which of the approaches to psychology best fits with each bullet? So if you were to look at these concepts, which one do they fit best with? Does it fit better with, social cognitive, with behaviorism, with humanistic, with psychoanalytic or psychodynamic? Which one fits best? And we're going to go ahead and check your work on that tomorrow. So this way you can see how you do. Same thing here. Consider all the concepts we talked about today. And as kind of a little cap up review, try to place them where they best fit. So which theory, if you take something like optimal arousal, which of these categories does it fit best with? Now, some concepts are going to fit well in one area and it's going to seem strongly suited to that section, and others can go in multiple areas. So think about that as well. Use this as a review and kind of a way to organize what we covered today and test yourself on the connections between these concepts. All right, here is the AP practice. It's a research methods question and it has 6 pieces. So remember on the AP exam, when you get a question like this, you will have 6 tasks and you'll have 15 minutes. So if you're going to use this question, which I strongly recommend, take some time and set a timer, 15 minutes, read the question and respond thoroughly to each question. If you go a little over 15 minutes, that's fine. We're just practicing. And we will be able to go over your work on this tomorrow. I have some news. So next week, May 4th to May 8th, AP Psychology YouTube is going to be doing exam prep week. And we're going to have timed practice exams, lots of exam tips, and some special guests. So these are just 2 of our special guests that we're going to have. One of them is Elizabeth Loftus. I don't know why Dr. Steele's PhD disappeared from my screen. So that is Claude Steele, PhD. And Elizabeth Loftus, as you might recall, she's a distinguished professor of psychological science and law. She's an expert on memory, and she is from the University of California, Irvine. I would recommend potentially watching her TED Talk. It's really great, called How Reliable Is Your Memory? She's also published numerous books. Claude Steele, PhD, is a professor of psychology at Stanford, and he's a social psychologist, and he did a lot of amazing work with stereotypes and stereotype threat. And he has an amazing book, which I would recommend highly, called Whistling Vivaldi, How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do. So just amazing researchers, and so excited that they're going to be here to help you. So also next week, we decided that we're going to open it up to some questions. So Dr. Swope and myself have set up a Gmail. So if you have some questions, you can go ahead and start emailing them to us. Now, we can't guarantee that we're going to answer every email or answer every question. But if you have a question, you might be chosen to have it answered live tomorrow or next week. And if you want us to mention you by name, you have to kind of indicate that in your email, right? And if we do, we would use maybe your first name and your school, or your first name and your town. So we'd love to recognize you and your great questions and your great comments. So don't be shy. Again, make sure you have like your first name and your school. And this is going to be for tomorrow and next week to just help you really feel prepared for the AP exam. Real quickly, I have a few slides here at the end to help you find those FRQs. So the College Board has placed a bunch of new FRQs for you to use on My AP Classroom, but you don't have to have your teacher assign them to you. So you would just log on, scroll to see your classes and access AP Classroom. Then you can click on practice answering free response exam questions, or you can click here to go directly to this YouTube live stream. Over here, this is where you would click to start a question if you wanted to do a practice FRQ. You could then type or upload your response and hit submit. Click yes to review your response, and then click yes to review. And then you can see the scoring guidelines and you can score yourself. You don't have to wait for your instructor to look over anything. You can review to see examples of what a response should include to make sure that you can earn all the points. And you can submit and click finish. Thank you for watching. I hope that you guys will send us some questions. You know, it wouldn't hurt to send a picture of your dog or cat or other pet. Maybe we could put your pet in the video as well. So have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow for Theories of Emotion.